Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, thanks for tuning in and welcome to episode 100 of the podcast. Before we get into this interview with Dr. Eric Helms, I really just wanted to get sappy for a second and share my excitement about this major milestone, because it wouldn't have been possible without my stubbornness and your continued support, listening to every single episode, sharing, rating, reviewing. I could not be any happier that we've made it this far. Therefore, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode and all those that will come. Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Eric Helms again. Eric, thanks for joining the podcast for the fourth time, I believe.
Four, Pete. All right. I thought this was my third, but awesome. I'm actually, I'm overachieving, and I appreciate it. I have you to thank for that.
Oh, well, yes, you are definitely the most frequently returning guest at this point. So you're doing quite well for yourself. Top of the leaderboard.
Killing them. Just kind of at me. Send location to all your other guests. That's what's up. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, today I wanted to ask you to discuss with me techniques that I haven't yet decided what the best term to define is, really, because there are lots of terms for them. They're called advanced techniques. They're called sometimes metabolite techniques. What's your favorite term, or what do you think is the most appropriate term to define them, and why?
It depends on the technique, but I think probably what most of them do is their efficiency techniques when we really think about it, because you're able to get hopefully comparable amounts of stimulus from typically what is less time. And the only potential trade-off is the effort involved. Now, you could categorize them as advanced techniques because I think more advanced bodybuilders or lifters in general are better at maintaining a high effort output. They're better at gauging their proximity to failure. And they have more experience with pushing themselves to their own limits, so they know them better. But I don't think they're necessarily advanced techniques. I don't like the term advanced techniques because it implies that you should not be using them until you're advanced. And I don't think that's the case. I also don't like the term intensity techniques because some of them are, while many of them are based around training to failure, some of them are actually useful because of what they do with volume or quote unquote effective volume, if you will. So there's not a great term for them, and that's why I tend to focus on like time-saving techniques or efficiency techniques. Hasn't caught on in the literature. I doubt it ever will. I think intensity and advanced techniques are what's embedded, so we kind of have to just accept what is colloquially used. But yeah, anything under the umbrella of drop sets, certain types of supersets, rest pause, or myo reps, which is basically the same thing. And yeah, like quote unquote post failure techniques like forced reps, etc. I think are all fit under this umbrella.
Thanks for that. I thought I'd start with that question because it led into a good discussion about the definition of them as a whole. And then what I was thinking of doing was going into each technique that you've just named one by one. Is that all right with you?
Absolutely. I love it.
Awesome. So let's start with one that actually is very popular regardless of the advancement level of the trainee, and that's supersets. And there are several types of them. Could you talk about each type?
Yeah, so supersets basically just means doing two exercises back to back. And there are different ways of defining them, but I think probably the most accepted version is saying a superset doesn't give any more specification other than I'm doing 2 exercises back to back.
Mhm.
So you could rightly call a bicep exercise followed by a quad exercise a superset. You could rightly call a bicep exercise followed by a triceps exercise a superset. And you could also rightly call a biceps exercise followed by a biceps exercise a superset. But each one of those is going to have potentially different implications, uses, or contraindications, to use a big fancy word. Um, so first, the question is, well, why would you ever want to do this? Isn't it better
Mhm.
to rest longer? And I think that's something that is generally accepted in the evidence-based, kind of fitness space. And it comes down to what's your goal. If your goal is maximal force output, accumulating, the highest, like actual load on the bar, then yeah, you do want to rest longer, assuming that the exercise you're pairing with the other exercise is going to negatively impact it. So it wouldn't make sense for a powerlifter, for example, to superset their squats and their deadlifts, right?
Mhm.
Um, there's a pretty easy example of it. Now, from what has been studied, essentially a useful parallel to always keep in mind for
Mhm.
all of these techniques, because we're often doing something different than just resting,
Mhm.
doing another exercise during the rest or a drop or et cetera, or mixing or doing something different than just your traditional set rest, complete one exercise and then move on, is the overall data we have on rest periods. And now in 2024 we have enough data to generally indicate that if you are to match for total work, shorter rest periods don't seem to be a negative for hypertrophy. Now, with that said, I do think there are probably some indications to where um, that could be an issue, and this is more theoretical versus having hard data on it. And that is what is causing the reduction in workload when you do short rest intervals.
Mhm.
So, for example, if you're doing a isolation movement for your biceps or calves, or let's say your lateral delts, or I should say your middle delts, the cardiorespiratory demand is going to be quite low. So the overall systemic fatigue is going to be quite low. You'll feel an intense burn, but you could probably still talk while you're doing your set, except when you're holding your breath and doing a Valsalva. So if you were to do a bunch of, like series of drop sets and supersets for, cable lateral raises and dumbbell lateral raises and front raises, or multiple bicep exercises, um, you're probably not going to be so out of breath and under such an oxygen debt that it's going to start enhancing your perception of effort, increasing fatigue, and that you're actually huffing and puffing and unable to recover from that systemically. In those cases, there is probably no issue with whatever drop in load you experience or drop in reps, because the fatigue is going to be local to the muscle and is
Mhm.
probably going to be due to actual muscle fiber fatigue. And what we know from training to failure with high or low loads is that those can produce comparable amounts of hypertrophy if effort is the same and the number of sets is the same. So we've got this kind of convergence of data, indicating that, hey, you should, if you do the same amount of work, and proximity to failure similar, rest periods shouldn't matter.
Mhm.
However, however, if you are a 400-pound squatter and you are doing reps with 315 for sets of 8 to 12, and you manage to fatigue yourself so much from doing a lower body series of supersets or rest pauses or these quote unquote time efficiency techniques, jumping from lunges to leg press to squats, to the point where you're now actually hitting failure and fatigue with 135 on the bar, I don't know for sure that that is because of local muscular fatigue. The energy output from doing that type of work is really high. It's comparable to like running a 400-meter sprint. And it could just be that your systemic fatigue is leading to that, while there's actually not only just a lack of uh, local muscular stimulus, but actually an inhibition of your ability to produce the central drive to actually contract those muscles and recruit a bunch of high threshold motor units. So there is some data, it's mechanistic, looking at MPS on rest periods, and some data that might indicate even when you do match work, there might be some poor outcomes in certain circumstances. So I think that's an important conceptual thing to understand before I jump into basically everything else. So,
Yeah.
with that said, I think supersets are a totally fine way to train if your goal is hypertrophy for small muscle groups or generally exercises that don't produce a ton of fatigue. And then
Mm-hmm.
you just have to think about how much am I getting done? And there are cases where you can get a similar amount of work done compared to straight sets in a shorter time period by doing agonist supersets, that is, training the
Mm-hmm.
same muscle group back to back. But I generally don't think you have to think a little bit more about it, and it's unclear if they're always gonna be beneficial, and you do have to worry about, systemic fatigue to some degree, and you have to think about the total work accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
However, a very clear winner, the back-to-back champ, if you will, to use a pun, is the agonist-antagonist paired superset,
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes called APS. And this is basically doing a push and then a pull, training the agonist and the antagonist. This has been studied multiple times, and the worst outcomes are that people perform a similar amount of volume training in this way. And the best outcomes, which we've seen actually in seal row bench press comparisons, as well as leg extension leg curl comparisons, is that
Mm-hmm.
you actually get a little more volume when performing antagonist paired sets, which is pretty cool. So, what the heck exactly am I talking about, and how are they done in the research so we can understand this finding where they might even be better than straight sets?
Mm-hmm.
What we're comparing is someone doing bench press and going immediately to, or how long ever it takes to get up and change machines and set up, load the bar, uh, to a seal row or a bench row, chest supported barbell row, if you want to be real specific. And finding that, and then after that, then resting your 2 minutes, for example. Now, you're some people, they respond to this and go, "Oh, man, that's more tiring. I've done 2 exercises in a row. Wouldn't that impede performance?" And essentially the answer is, well, how good is your conditioning?
Mm-hmm.
Because while you are doing, let's say, instead of saying 20 seconds of work with 3 minutes rest and then 20 seconds of work, you're doing 40 seconds of work and then doing 3 minutes. So the rest to work ratio is now lower. You're doing more work to rest, but the local musculature is actually getting longer rest. Now, instead of just getting 2 minutes of rest, you're getting 2 minutes of rest plus the 20 seconds that you spent training the other exercise. So, this is probably acting to actually enhance performance or even potentially just provide active recovery. As when you're benching or you're pressing or you're pulling, the antagonists are moving, but they're not actively contracting. They're just acting as co stabilizers. It could provide some metabolic faster recovery, or it might just be simply the extra 20 or 30 seconds of rest that's resulting in this higher work output that's been observed in both leg extension leg curl pairs as well as row and presses. So, antagonist paired sets are actually really useful. It ends up being a relatively substantial time saving amount if you structure your upper body days in this way specifically. So if you think your traditional upper body, it might be a horizontal press, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull, bicep, tricep, maybe a delt isolation movement, and you're out. You're essentially doing each one of those things with another exercise. You're going bench row rest, shoulder press lat pull down rest, and then you're doing bicep tricep rest. And then, as we'll talk about in a different technique, you could take that isolation small muscle group exercise for delts and do something like a drop set or a rest pause, and you can truly finish your workout in about 60 to 70% of the time if you're minding your p's and q's. And the only thing that you need to make sure of is that you're in sufficient cardiorespiratory shape so that doing so doesn't end up creating those problems I mentioned earlier that can happen in agonist supersets, especially with lower body exercises.
Well, what I hear from this is first that you must be reading my mind because you covered pretty much every question that I would have had on supersets. But also, it seems like of the types that we've discussed, potentially the one that's most supported by the literature to be beneficial for hypertrophy is agonist antagonist supersets. whereas agonist supersets, where you train the same muscle, may not be quite as beneficial, or at least it's unclear if it is. And then there's also a third type where you would train unrelated muscle groups. And do we know anything about the benefits of that, or what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so these are sometimes called peripheral supersets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these are very context dependent. There have been some studies on this. There's been studies pairing squat and bench,
Mm-hmm.
and there are some slight reductions in performance when you look at that, but they are pretty slight. And I would suspect that if you were to do something like squat bicep curl or
Mm-hmm.
squat calf raise, or I'll tell you, I personally even do a leg press leg curl, and I don't see any negative impact of it. But you do need to be in good cardiorespiratory shape to do that. Um, that it really depends on how good a shape are you in and appropriate exercise selection. I think sometimes people don't always know what muscle groups are involved in the exercise they're doing because the
Mm-hmm.
functional anatomy is actually quite complex. Like a lot of people would think that the hamstrings are of course involved in a leg press because the leg press includes hip extension and the hamstrings are a hip extensor because I saw that in my personal trainer certification. Damn it. However, if you understand that they're a biarticular muscle and that they perform not only hip extension or they help the glutes with hip extension, but they also perform knee flexion. And you're going, oh, hold on, I'm doing a whole lot of knee extension in a leg press. If I'm doing a whole lot of knee flexion, they're going to be opposing each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you read the research showing that squats and leg press don't seem to produce hypertrophy in the hamstrings, and EMG values are really low when we look at hamstring contribution to like squat patterns, then you start to understand, oh, I guess the hamstrings aren't doing a whole lot during that, so it's not a big deal. And that does seem to be my personal experience. So now it's exercise dependent and it's goal dependent. I
Mm-hmm.
think if you were a power lifter, you probably wouldn't want to pair bench and squat because they're both really independently important and they're performed in such a manner that you're trying to get them into being as much of a full body movement as possible. You're doing an arch, you're getting a leg drive, you are uh, wedging yourself under the bar. It's a low bar position. You're moving max weight, big deep breath, and you care about the load on the bar. So a small reduction in load, which you could make up for by doing more reps or sets if you're a bodybuilder, that's not necessarily a worthwhile trade-off when peak load is what you care about as a power lifter. With that said, not all sessions for a power lifter are the same. If you're coming in and you're doing lower RPE heavy practice work, like 3 singles at 80% between your two more voluminous or high volume days, that you can get done even if the RPE gets a little bit higher and it doesn't matter. Um, yeah, you could absolutely do a single at 80% on the squat, run over, jump under the bar for bench and do the same thing. Um, where I think they probably have more utility though is for hypertrophy oriented goals.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where a leg day can potentially save you some time where you can't necessarily, and you probably shouldn't do antagonist paired sets on every single leg exercise or peripheral, like I would say the most extreme thing, and I don't recommend it for most people, is probably to do something like a leg press and a leg curl together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's me, and I've played with it to make sure that it doesn't actually drop my volume or reduce my performance output. I can't do that on hack squat, and I can't do leg extension and RDL. Those actually start to really obviously drop off my performance. So hack squats, RDLs, Bulgarian split squats, lunges, deadlifts, or squats, I think you generally want to just have those be done on their own or potentially with a calf raise. I think you can do that. Um, and that's actually something I do is I do my RDLs with calf raises.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't necessarily strictly follow RDL calf raise rest. I'll do RDL, rest a little bit, calf raise, rest a little bit longer. And it's slightly more efficient than just doing RDLs on their own. But ultimately, you're just going to have to play it by ear and don't be too rigid in your usage of these types of supersets. There's nothing better about making sure that you only do 2 minutes after your antagonist or peripheral paired superset. Remember that it's only there to save time. It's not some type of magic enhancement. So I do them because I have a lot of work that I have to get through that seems to be required for me to advance at this stage. And I'm a busy person. So if I've got 30 sets of chest that I need to get done in a week, or 30 sets of back, or with indirect work, 40 plus sets for my arms, and also 20 sets for my lower body, I've got 5 days a week to train across. I want to get those done in no longer than 90 minutes. And those would otherwise take me 2 hours each if I did not do this. So that's what I care about, is making sure I'm performing and being effective, and then cutting down on time as much as possible. So ultimately, I think the peripheral supersets, you're looking at pairing smaller muscle group, really just not systemically fatiguing exercises that are uninvolved with a compound exercise. Generally staying away from pairing two compound exercises when one is more full body esque. So bench and deadlift, bench and squat. You could, like lat pull down, leg press, you could technically do, but can you? Without actually getting just overall too fatigued. So that's kind of the consideration there.
That makes sense. And thank you for reiterating that the goal of supersets is time efficiency and that you can be flexible with the way that you execute a superset. Because when you were talking about the rest intervals, I typically program and do myself. I will take some rest between the two exercises. So I'll do uh, leg extension, rest a little bit, leg curl, rest a couple minutes, and then go again, for example. So I'm glad that you brought that up as a possibility so that people don't get too fixated on what the prescription should be.
No, that's well said. And in practice, what I do, like when I track it on Boost Camp, is I'll put it as a B exercise. Like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I've got incline bench and single arm lat pull down. But I'm not sitting there going, immediately after I finish my lat pull down, I have to only rest 2 minutes before I then go back to incline press.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just doing one, then the other, and I'm going when I'm ready. Period.
Yeah,
You
me
know?
too.
Yeah.
That's what I do. I typically ask myself, could I do 5 more reps without my breath or my heart getting in the way? And if I'm ready, then I'll do that.
Yeah, I look at it as matching my like I know what my performance drop off is. I'm doing straight sets. So
Mm-hmm.
if I do a set of 10 on lat pull down and that's at a 9 RPE, I know I can typically repeat that performance with it only getting up to a 9.5 or a 10.
Mm.
So it I get feedback pretty. I've been lifting for 20 years. I think that's important just to acknowledge
Yeah.
there's some intuitive knowledge I have here. So I know that I'm going too quickly, or that I may be just fatigued from my program overall. And that's, the knowing the distinction is important and takes experience. But if I'm going too quickly through my workout and I do bench and I do lat pull down, and then I do bench and I do lat pull down, and on that second pairing, I've dropped 2 reps or I've climbed up 2 full RPE points,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm thinking I am probably like cutting this too close, Um, I'm trying to get basically the most impulse, which is just the force time integral. How much area under the curve in terms of muscle force am I producing? Which is going to be roughly a proxy of load and reps when you think about it. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to get the same performance I would get as if I was doing straight sets or very close to it in less time. Essentially, that's the way if you're doing it quote unquote right.
Yeah, that makes sense. In hindsight, I do assess performance as well. If Because as you say, the more you train, you kind of get a sense of how many reps you drop on each exercise, set to set, or don't drop, depending on how your own body responds.
Hmm.
And in hindsight, yes, if I see, okay, I probably didn't rest long enough if I dropped 3 reps on this set when normally I would drop maybe 1 or 2. But beforehand, when I'm trying to get ready for the next set, I'm thinking, is my cardiovascular system going to get in the way? And until I feel that that's the case, then I keep resting.
For sure.
So I think that we can tie a bow on supersets. We covered them in quite a lot of depth. And I wanted to move on to rest pause sets and
Mm.
starting with how you execute them.
Yeah, so rest pause is a cool technique that is similar to a few other things that are going to be described in the literature. So someone who is reading a ton of research might find yourself calling these different things than someone who is in the trenches. So in the research, you will find cluster sets, you will find rest redistribution sets, and you will also find rest pause sets. and they all are a bit different. So rest redistribution sets are a good place to start because they essentially take the same amount of reps, same load, and same time period that you would have if you're doing straight sets, and you're just redistributing it. An easy way to think of this is if you're doing 3 sets of 10 with a given rest interval between those 3 sets, instead, you're doing 10 sets of 3 with shorter rest intervals so that the total amount of time is the same. And you use the same load, right? This is not a time efficient technique. Cluster sets are done for the goal of maximizing barbell velocity and power output most of the time and staying further away from failure when you have sufficient time to be able to do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, I should say rest redistribution sets are a compromise when you want to get no additional time, but trying to get higher barbell velocity and lower load. This is something that you might use in a team sport athlete, a strength conditioning setting, etc. Another thing that's quite similar is cluster sets. And this is where you're still doing the same amount of work with the same loads and you're getting multiple clusters of reps, but you can rest even longer. Now this is actually the opposite of time efficiency. This
Mm-hmm.
is additional time spent training because you're saying I have the time and my priority is maximizing the actual kinetic variables, my velocity or my force output. Again, really useful for power-based outcomes, S&C, not really super useful necessarily for even powerlifting or bodybuilding outcomes. You powerlifter, you're doing low reps anyway. You probably want higher loads, and if you're doing moderate loads at low reps for a heavy practice day, again, you just rest until you're ready to do it again. But for S&C settings, these are both potentially useful things that you would choose based upon your available time in a power-based phase, right? And they are actually potentially worse for hypertrophy because you're reducing the amount of reps that you're doing closer to failure, and you're opting to produce less fatigue, and you're seeing less mechanical slowing due to fatigue of the barbell, which means that you're probably not exposing as many high threshold motor units to high forces, except for brief periods when you're accelerating the bar. So you're definitely focusing on getting more power-based adaptations rather than max force production or hypertrophy adaptations. Okay, got those out of the way. We got clusters. We got rest pause. Sorry, we got clusters and rest redistribution out of the way. Rest pause, however, in the literature is typically when you are going to failure on each one of these clusters or rest redistribution sets. And they occur after an initial set. Then you rest 20 seconds, you get as many as you can. You rest 20 seconds, you get as many as you can. You rest 20 seconds, you get as many as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar to the concept of myoreps, which Børge Fagerli developed and has talked about for a long time. So due credit is there. And essentially, the only difference is that in the literature and in typical training situations, rest pause is you're training really, really close to failure. Myoreps, you're still training reasonably close to failure, but you typically have like activation sets that are done sufficiently close to failure. And then when you stop is auto-regulated based upon when you exceed that initial proximity to failure. So for example, you might do a set of 8 to 20 to start around a 2 RIR, and then you take that load and you keep going until you either drop off in the number of reps or you exceed a certain RIR. And you can set them up in various different ways, and they kind of have built-in auto-regulation for how much you do. In the literature, the way they've been compared is to do like 4 to 5 rest pauses after an initial set and compare that to roughly 3 to 4 just straight sets. And the data we have thus far indicates pretty similar hypertrophy, which is kind of cool.
Mm.
And these are comparative loads. So we're talking like, 70, 80% of 1RM. And I think rest pauses are probably best done, and they've been consistently observed to be just as good when you're talking about isolation exercises.
Okay.
So if we're going to do a bicep curl series of rest pause, we might choose a load that we can get 8 to 20 reps with, and then just take about 5 breaths, and then get as many as you can. And I would typically say stop once you can't get at least like 4 reps. I think that's a decent rule of thumb.
Mm.
Or if you're trying to get what we think is roughly equivalent, or I should say, if I want to be a statistics nerd, not significantly different from a certain number of straight sets. If you got 3 straight sets that you're supposed to do on bicep curls, and that's going to take you, at least 6 minutes of rest plus another minute of training, you're like, oh shit, the gym closes in 2 minutes. And that gal looks like she wants to go out tonight, and she's giving me the eye, like, get the hell out of my gym. I don't get paid enough for this. Okay. Why are you here at 9 p.m. anyway? I'm trying to have a good Friday night. And you're like, I got you. Sandra, quit giving me the eye. I got you. And then boom, what you do is you take a set of 10 to failure, and then you just take 5 deep breaths, and you tack on 3 more sets of 3 to 6, or just whatever you can get. And that will probably be roughly equivalent, just doing a few more drop sets. And if you think about that from the perspective of the volume load, it's probably going to be slightly less volume load. But if you think about it from the perspective of how much fiber fatigue did you experience, it's probably pretty similar. I'm loath to use the term effective reps, not because it's not a useful concept, but because people often take a more literal interpretation of, hey, it's only the last 5 reps that counts, which data would not support. But the general concept of the closer you get to failure, the more stimulus you're accruing is certainly true. And I think a way we can think about it goes back to some of the concepts I was talking about earlier. If we understand how we accrue a stimulus, we often talk about mechanisms of hypertrophy. And some people kind of get it twisted when they think about mechanical tension. The average person, if you ask them, oh, how do I focus on the mechanical tension pathway to muscle growth? They go, oh, you got to lift heavy loads. And unfortunately, that's not really the way it works. So mechanical tension is actually something that is sensed by mechanosensors. And there are various mechanosensors, which are simply organelles, protein complexes, or actually the myonuclei themselves, which is kind of cool, within the actual muscle fiber that sense at the fiber level whether there is tension being sensed. So, for example, we have titin, the titin molecule, which acts kind of like a spring, which attaches the sarcomere to the cytoskeleton. That's where myosin and actin actually bind. And during the eccentric, titin unfolds and it starts a signaling cascade, which senses tension and starts some of the process of signaling growth. In addition to that, we have what's called costomeres, sometimes called focal adhesions in older literature, which are there for lateral force transmission, but also are sensing. And they are like being able to not only direct force, but also sense force across the muscle. And then within each muscle fiber or the muscle cell, when it is compressed and you're lengthening and compressing the fiber, it actually flattens the myonuclei, the nuclei of the muscle cells, and that itself is actually thought to be a mechanosensor. In addition to that, we have, I believe, stretch-sensitive ion gates that are occurring during contraction, and there's others. There's a protein molecule which I can't remember, and we're just uncovering this. There's probably even more mechanosensors. There are mechanosensors in tendon as well, but they don't seem to be connected to signaling for hypertrophy. They're probably related to bone adaptations. So yes, mechanical tension is higher when you're lifting a heavier load, and that might be relevant to something like your tendon, the risk of a muscle tear, or like in the fascia, or the bone adaptations. But as far as actually signaling hypertrophy, it's happening on a per fiber level. So when you take a light load all the way to true mechanical failure, what's happening is what we think is motor unit cycling. So Henneman's size principle, and I'm going way deep on muscle physiology, but it's important to understand these concepts, to understand these techniques and why they don't do what many people think they do. Henneman's size principle states that we recruit motor units, and therefore the fibers they innervate, based upon the needs. And that's generally thought of in the perspective of the force requirement, right? So if I lift a maximal load, everything's turned on. If I lift a reasonably heavy but near maximal load, everything's still turned on, 80, 90% of 1RM, somewhere in there or higher. However, we know that fibers fatigue at different rates. And our body is basically optimizing for energy efficiency. So when you start to train with a light load and you're getting closer and closer and closer to failure, while your slow twitch fibers, which are innervated by those motor units, are being recruited and they're doing their work, doing their work, doing their work, and they're slowly starting to drop out, we're going to start bringing in higher threshold motor units as more of them drop out. And because they fatigue quickly, they get cycled in and out. So we see the overall amplitude on EMG being less than a heavy load. But when we look at actual training studies, we see that hypertrophy is similar. So
Mhm.
what's actually occurring is that while they're not all on at the same time because of motor unit cycling and some dropping out due to fatigue, by the time you get to task failure, you've achieved the same thing in a circuitous manner that all the fibers have reached a sufficient point of fatigue.
Mhm.
So essentially, whether you lift heavy and do a set of 5, because it's got to be 5 with 80% of 1 RM, and you stop, 3, 4 reps shy of failure, that's probably going to be roughly equivalent to the training stimulus of doing a set of, say, 20 and stopping just a few reps shy of failure. So that's an important concept to understand when we're thinking about rest pause and why you might actually produce less total work. But if more of that work is accruing closer to fatigue, we should be in a state where we're still getting very high fiber fatigue and therefore a stimulus because you're actually contracting at a slower speed due to fatigue. You're exposing the individual fibers to higher tension, and we can get there with less total work, although perception of effort will be higher. So it's a bit of a trade off. That was a long explanation to basically say do a couple extra rest pauses compared to how many straight sets you're going to do and go close to failure, and you'll get a similar outcome. But that's basically the answer.
That makes a lot of sense. And so if I'm looking at each training variable, you said that in terms of volume, as you've just re-explained, if you have 3 straight sets, maybe you want to do 4 rest pause sets. In terms of intensity of effort, you've mentioned that typically rest pause sets are taken to failure, whereas myo reps, which are similar, are stopped maybe a couple reps before failure. So my question there is, if I were to do a rest pause set to RPE 8 or 9, would that have similar benefits as to taking it all the way to failure?
I think that's exercise dependent. And if you were to try to do rest pause on a heavy compound exercise, especially for the lower body, and you're doing rest pause in terms of going to failure, um, the drop off and I would say the safety is probably less favorable. You're going to see pretty substantial drop offs in reps. The mental fatigue is going to be really high. It's going to be difficult to push yourself to that point,
Mm-hmm.
and the trade off in time may not be the trade off worth the trade off in mental fatigue and the risk and safety. And you may not actually be able to push yourself to that point. You may be perceiving fatigue, but perceptual fatigue is not the same thing as actual true fatigue. And like I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier, is it cardiorespiratory or is it inhibition or is it actual local muscular fatigue? So I think if you're going to do you can do myo reps on compound exercises, and I think that's worth acknowledging. If you're hanging around that 8 to 9 RPE, if you're always keeping one in the tank, you can probably get a similar outcome. It is still harder though. So I think that's one thing to acknowledge is that to a lesser degree, myo reps and certainly rest pause, you're making the same amount of work or the same amount of stimulus, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
um, feel harder.
Mm-hmm.
Not a big deal when the overall task difficulty is low, like on isolation exercise, but potentially an issue if you're talking about a compound movement or especially a lower body compound movement. So I think personally, I would say that definitely rest pause and drop sets, which I'm sure we'll talk about, are pretty much in the realm of isolation movements or maybe some machine based upper body compounds,
Mm-hmm.
while myo reps can be used for any exercise really, and you just have to be aware of that slight trade off.
Okay, that makes sense. And it covers exercise selection as well. In terms of progression, how it would be, it seems like it could be harder to establish whether you are making progress with rest
Mm.
pause. So how would what overload strategies would you suggest?
I find there's typically two use cases when people end up using rest pause. It is when they need to use it, like, oh shit, it's a holiday, and then the gym closes in a second. Sandra, I'm so sorry, I did it again. Right. That is one use case. Yeah. Where you normally do straight sets, and this time you're doing rest pause. The other use case is you are purposely programming rest pause. And I find the latter is actually much easier because if you're tracking your training, you will see the load and the reps and the RPE of each set and each drop. And
Mm-hmm.
I normally like to program it having the same number of drops. And then I will simply repeat the load and try to get more reps. And I'll have some upper threshold, kind of like a double progression, where, okay, once I get more reps than this on my top set, I'll increase load.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think there's many ways to do that. I think you can operate in the 8 to 20 rep range. Just know that if you're doing a rest pause with something like a single digit number of reps, you're going to be getting doubles and triples after your next sets.
Yeah.
So I think you generally want to use a load that allows at least 3 to 4 reps on on the majority of your drops. Because like if you start with like a 6 rep set and then you try that same load again, you're going to get a double maybe, it's going to be very challenging to accumulate a comparable volume to doing 3 by 6. So this is generally something where you're working in that like 3 times 8, maybe to 20 with rest
Mm-hmm.
pause. Um, and yeah, so it's easy to progress if you use that model. If you're kind of using the open-ended myo reps progression, it's auto-regulated. And I think it's just important to use the same load when you're trying to compare progression. And then you can just look at what's the total amount of work that I accumulated. And if that is generally trending upwards, then good news. That's doing well. You're kind of basically looking at your total reps at that load across your sets.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for explaining that. So I believe that the only question I have left on rest pause and the Mayo reps as well, since I was going to bring them up anyway. Um, we mentioned, when would the best exercises to implement it with potentially or the most appropriate, and the fact that again it's a time efficiency technique.
Mhm.
Are there any practical applications that you think would rest pause sets would be especially helpful for?
Yeah, I really like them for small muscle group isolation exercises. I basically see those and drop sets as equivalent,
Mm,
which we can talk about. So, going back to that exemplar upper body workout where we go through antagonist paired sets the whole way through, and then let's say we're finishing with lateral lateral raises of some type. That's an excellent candidate for doing drop sets or rest pause or myo reps because you're going to be experiencing much higher levels of fatigue, but on an exercise that shouldn't produce a lot of systemic fatigue. And you can be confident that that top set with 3 drops or that top set with 3 rest pauses is going to be doing a similar amount of stimulus to 3 sets. And if you did a straight set, um, you're having to get yourself to the point of that same level of fatigue that you're kind of already starting at with each one of those. But you
mhm,
can be confident that that fatigue's not occurring from cardiorespiratory or inhibition related reasons, right? So you're essentially able to get a similar stimulus in a pretty substantially reduced amount of time. You know, lateral raises aren't producing a ton of, you know, fatigue systemically. So you maybe only need to rest a minute to 2 minutes between sets. Let's just say 90 seconds. But if you do 3 sets of lateral raises, let's say they're your last exercise, you don't have to rest another time afterwards. You can just leave. So I'm being like really generous with how quickly you can get through 3 sets of lateral raises. You're doing them moderately high reps. So you're doing, let's say, 2 30-second sets. So that's a minute. And you got a minute and a half, a minute and a half. So you got 4 minutes of time to get through these 3 sets. If you do a rest pause series, you're looking at a minute. You know,
mhm.
you do your one set for 30 seconds, and you do like 5 breaths, and you go again. So, um, you will get through it in a substantially reduced amount of time, a third, at most probably. So, that can cut down on time. And on a training day like say a shoulders and arms day, you can use a lot of it. because it's a bunch of these exercises. Outside of potentially doing like a rear delt row and an overhead press at the start, you could do rest pause for everything else. My most efficient training day that I currently have in my program is my shoulders and arms day, where I do antagonist paired sets to kick the day off on a shoulder press and a rear delt row, and then I jump into almost exclusively rest pause and drop set work.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. So then I believe the last technique we'll be able to cover today is drop sets, which you alluded to just now. And so here again, we have a couple of types of drop sets. And so could you start by defining those?
Yeah, I mean, the main form of drop sets is just reducing load and going again. So it's just basically an extended set. And for the same reason on a rest pause, why you might go from doing 12 to only being able to do 5 reps, is the same reason why after you go to failure for, let's say, 12 with that same load at 80%, you can, instead of staying at 80% and getting 5 reps, you can go to 65% of 1RM and maybe get more like 9 reps. And ultimately, I think it's personal preference. Drop sets end up being a little bit faster though. So the reason being is there's zero rest. It's just the amount of time it takes to change weights. So my personal preference, and this may have to do with a little bit of masochism on my part, so just take it for what it's worth, because you end up doing more reps. You have to push yourself to failure with lighter loads, and there's zero rest. I tend to do drop sets. So when I have the choice of rest pause or drop sets, I am typically doing just like a machine. I go pin to pin, and I just go to failure, pin to pin, go to failure, pin to pin, go to failure. And it ends up basically being, if you choose a load that you can do 12 to 15 reps with, and then you do 3 drops, where you're probably getting 6 to 10 reps on each one of those, it ends up just being one long extended set that lasts maybe a minute and a half. So that's even faster than the example I gave before, where you're doing the rest pause, where each rest pause takes 20 seconds. So you do 3 rest pauses, you're already at a minute. And then you have the length of each set. It's not a whole lot faster, but it is a few, like you might get 30 seconds faster. And if you do 4 or 5 exercises, you're looking at saving yourself a few minutes here and there. So that, I think, is, if there's another type of drop set you wanted to cover, we can. But the main one I was thinking of is simply dropping load.
Oh yeah, I should have clarified that I was thinking about your massive training guide, where you defined not really types of drop sets, but strategies to implement them. So there was the add-on
Yes.
strategy and the standalone strategy. So that's what I was hinting at.
Gotcha. Yes. Actually, yeah, that's a really good point. There's different ways to use the drop sets. So what I just described was a standalone utilization of them. And big shout out to Mike Zerdos, by the way, for developing the massive training guide, where we go through all of this and actually do the calculations for time, volume, loads, all that good stuff. I contributed, largely to kind of like editing his work and throwing in some bodybuilding stuff, but he talked a lot about different strategies you would use. It's free to download. massresearchreview.com, plug, shameless, sell, buy now, Sunday.
It will go in the show notes for sure.
Thank you very much, Nick. So anyway, the as a standalone strategy, it's just all you're doing. As an add-on strategy, it's essentially saying, listen, I want to get some volume today for the purposes of hypertrophy. And since strength is predominantly related to the peak loads that I'm training with, not necessarily how much I accumulate with an average load over time, I don't want to sit here and do a top single and then do 3 sets of 5 at 80% of that single. I would prefer to do a top single, drop and do a bunch of reps, drop and do a bunch of reps, drop and do a bunch of reps, wave bye to Sandra, be a little bit more sweaty than I otherwise would have, and leave the gym, right? So that is a perfectly viable strategy, and it makes a lot of sense when you're combining it with kind of your strength work. So if someone has the goals of combined strength and hypertrophy, that's where it probably makes more sense to do drop sets as essentially volume add-ons that are time saving. Because the volume you're accumulating after a top set, even as someone interested in strength, it's for the purpose of trying to generate enough work to produce hypertrophy.
Mm-hmm.
rather than being really like I know powerlifters do focus on their numbers. I'm one of them. I get it, but it's like your back off sets are the load you're using on them is just really not that important, at least in a hypertrophy phase. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there are phases where maybe you're limiting those failure, the proximity to failure on those, and you're trying to produce high forces through accelerating the bar as much as you can. And then you do care about the performance of the rep, not necessarily the load on the bar. But this would be a use case during a hypertrophy block for a powerlifter or someone interested in strength.
That makes sense. And since in terms of volume compared to straight sets, how do we count volume for drop sets? And are they equivalent? Is it a one-to-one comparison, or is it different?
Great question. Again, it comes down to the goal, and the volume load can be a little skewed depending upon how they're implemented. And I think it really comes down to thinking about what your goal is. To kind of reiterate my point. If the goal is hypertrophy and you are much like rest pause, if you're just programming drop sets, the progression is that you want to use the same drops and see if you can get more reps over time. So
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of comparing each drop to the same equivalent drop as last time.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you get to a certain point on the top drop, the first set with the number of reps at a given load or RPE, then you can go up and load. And then you're like, great, now I'm kind of at a new point in me comparing the next progression series, right? Again, the use case where you're like, "Ah, crap, gym closes in 5 minutes. I don't have time today. I need to get out of here." Um, I think the only thing you really want to be worrying about is perhaps doing one or two more drops in the number of straight sets planned, including your first set. So if you have 3 straight sets planned, you want to do 4 total sets or 5 total sets
Mm-hmm.
after the initial set, right? So, including the initial set, I should say. The the loads are so you can do more reps at a lower load and you will accumulate more volume load.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not volume load matters is kind of up for debate. Um, for strength, you could say, well, I'm more interested in like relative volume load or the peak load. So it's kind of like, okay, well, if I did the same top set as I would have otherwise, and then I dropped, I'm getting the same exposure to the same highest force. So it probably doesn't matter from a strength perspective. And then from a hypertrophy perspective, we know it's not actually volume load that is telling us what's going on. It's some combination of proximity to failure and then the total amount of work done. So the more of that work that's done near failure and you're producing high forces, roughly equivalent. And the data we have would suggest that much like rest pauses, if you're doing comparing to straight sets, if you're doing drop sets and you're doing a couple more drops, there's non-significant differences in the majority of the data we have, indicating that it can be just as good. And there's actually a few odd studies where it's slightly better doing drop sets or rest pause. But again, it's really tough to say like, is it a fair comparison? Like, are you doing more? Are you doing less? They're in the same ballpark when you look at just kind of like the mean change in standard deviation, even when there are significant differences. You can't say it's necessarily better. You just have to go like, all right, how much time did it take? How much effort did it take? How much total work did you do? And, are those equivalent comparisons? Because in some cases you might end up doing more or less with the drop set, but we can't really quantify like the internal load super well. So the one downside to drop sets and rest pause specifically is there's no really simple conversion, or there's no empirically validated conversion from straight sets to them.
Mm-hmm.
There is the simple kind of guidance I'm saying of, hey, if you're doing 3 sets, do 4. If you're doing 4 sets, do 5. Maybe do basically 1 to 2 more than you would have otherwise done from drops or rest pauses. But beyond that, and that roughly aligning with data indicating that those paradigms are not significantly different from one another, I can't say like, yeah, and we did a muscle biopsy analysis and actually measured the forces, and we did it in vitro then in vivo, and we don't have that. We probably won't have that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at best, we're going to have these long-term training studies where we're trying to match them at the start, but imperfectly, and then seeing whether that one did better than the other. Um, so I think it's useful to understand these concepts, but I think the best application is when you are going in and intentionally programming them with kind of the practical considerations I've talked about, and then looking for progression within exercise, within strategy, rather than kind of going apples to oranges.
That makes sense. And in terms of exercise selection, which exercises would be most appropriate? Would it be similar to rest pause sets?
Very similar. Rest, pause, yes, exactly, because it's typically always going to failure. Drop sets, because you're constantly changing load, there are some logistical considerations. Like you can easily do rest pause with dumbbells.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm doing, let's say, like an incline lateral raise where I'm trying to get just this portion to really emphasize the lengthened position. And for those who are listening and not watching, I was doing kind of like a cross body lateral raise to try to, with a dumbbell, knowing where gravity is, emphasize a more lengthened position versus a standing lateral raise where it's harder when the muscle is shortest. I can
Mm-hmm.
just rest my arm across my body with the dumbbell, take 5 breaths, and go again. I'm not going to do that for a drop set because I've got to grab 5 different dumbbells, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I got to be now. Not only is Sandra mad at me because I'm making her stay late on Friday, but the 2 other people who are also making Sandra stay late on Friday, who also want to do drop sets, I've just taken half the dumbbell rack. So I'm really being a jerk in this situation. Um, so for rest pause, free weights are on the table for certain muscle groups, right? Um, for drop sets, you're probably wanting to do machines almost exclusively because then it's just pin to pin, pin to pin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can do drop sets, and there's many great videos of people doing like drop sets on bench, strip a plate, strip a plate, strip a plate. Really, really strong people, or the opposite, adding plates just for fun because Instagram is cool. But like you need a partner, but you have to get up, take a plate off, take the other plate off, etc. Um, and it's fine, but it is much more logistically feasible when you're using cables or machines to simply just swap those pins around on a selectorized equipment.
Yeah, of course. Um, Final question I have, which covers all of these techniques really, is, well, not all, but primarily rest pause, myo reps, and drop sets. Since you've mentioned the lateral raise with one arm at a time, how do you use these techniques with with unilateral exercises? So using one limb at a time. Would you do that?
You can, you can. So if you're thinking about the the amount of rest that you'd get on your typical rest pause of like 20 seconds, and
Mm-hmm.
the fact that if you're choosing a load of, let's say, something you could do for 12, that your sets are then only going to be like 6 to 4 reps after that, and the fact that they're going to be slow reps as well, you can essentially just swap arm to arm and just keep going continuously.
Ah.
The only Yeah, the only time it becomes a problem is at the first set, because the first set's going to be a little longer than that 20 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you switch back to the other arm, that first arm is getting a little longer rest than it otherwise would have. So it depends on how OCD you are as to whether or not you can stomach the fact that your first arm will do one set with an extra 7 seconds of rest. If that bothers you, if you're starting to feel the little twitch happen, then this is not for you. But I am relatively comfortable doing it because theoretically, again, it's all about what is causing the fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when we're doing an isolation movement and we're training to fatigue and resting just enough so we can get a few more reps, we're maintaining a high level of muscular fatigue with very little or hopefully insufficient, but still maybe notable amount of cardiorespiratory fatigue. The limiting factor is going to be how fatigued is my delt. So if my left arm ends up getting, one less rep, but the reps overall were a bit more grindy, that's probably 6 of one, half dozen or the other. Because yeah, I lost a rep, but I didn't have to do one faster rep to get to that. you know.
Mm.
So it's unclear whether that's a notable enough difference. And if it really bothers you, next time you go to the gym, start with the other arm. You know, and it'll even out, not within session, but between sessions. So I think that's totally fine.
See, you bring up OCD, and that is where my question came from because I never figured out that you could do one arm and then the other arm immediately. So I was thinking, so you do all the sets on one arm, and then how do you know that you're gonna match performance on the other arm? And that always bothered me, so I've never done it. But now that you put it this way, where I can just swap arms, I'm like, oh, I can do this now.
That's one option. Another option, it's less time saving though, is you can start with the arm that you know is stronger,
Hmm.
and then you can just match it. And sorry, you start with the arm that is weaker, then you just match it, right?
Hmm. Yeah, which is
So,
what I would normally do.
which is totally fine, so long as you don't mind like your slightly bigger arm or more endurable arm. If it's not your bigger arm, doing less hard work. So yeah, I think ultimately though we're talking about basically generating a similar time integral, if you will, going back to that of
Hmm.
hard work. It probably won't make a substantial difference in the long run, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. You just opened up a whole new host of possibilities for me because I'm like, now I can do this unilaterally too.
You can, and the one I do just alternating is that dumbbell one. I
Hmm.
tend to do so. I will do the dumbbell lateral raise, rest pause, alternating arms, and then for my cable work, I will just do drop sets and just one arm's done, other arm's done. So obviously with drop sets you can't alternate because on a unilateral exercise, you have to keep dropping the stack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for covering all of these techniques with me today, Eric. That was excellent. And we already mentioned the massive training guide for the upper body, which I read, and it's really excellent. It talks about these techniques with examples of how to use them and how to apply them, whether your goal is hypertrophy or strength. And is there anything else that's new or that it's not new even that you want to plug that I can add to the show notes?
If someone wants to see what this visually looks like in practice, I was a
Hmm.
guest on the Renaissance Periodization channel not too long ago, and there was a workout that I went through, an upper body workout which consisted entirely of antagonist paired sets, and then rest pause and drop sets for a upper body session that I did. So that is, I think, probably a couple weeks old at the time of recording
Hmm.
on the RP channel. And I know that in the future, one will be coming out for my lower body and arm workout. And there is some in there, obviously a little bit less because it's lower body. But I think a really good example of this is available to see at Renaissance Periodization. And I think the thumbnail is an image of me like rowing or like doing a pull down across my body, and then me mostly naked. So yeah.
I watch the RP channel often. I'll find it. I'll find the video out and put it in the show notes. So thanks for that. And as usual, I'll send everybody to the 3DMJ website, to your Instagram profile, so everybody will be able to find you in case they don't know who you are, which I'd be surprised if they are in this space.
Well, it's an honor as always, and I greatly appreciate that.
Awesome. And dear listeners, thank you as well as always for tuning in, and I will talk to you next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.